Nightcrawler is the directional debut of Dan Gilroy. He wrote and directed this film. It stars Jake Gyllenhaal as Lou Bloom, who is a bit of a creepy loner wanting to be successful. He's feeling disenfranchised with the sort of American job market, wants to be successful, doesn't really seem to care at what he is successful, and he basically gets drawn into the world of sort of early morning rolling news in America and becomes what they call a Nightcrawler, which is the name given to guys who go out on behalf of the news networks and film accidents or robberies or whatever. You know, as the police are sort of cleaning up, they go in there and film and get the footage for the early morning news broadcast. So he gets sort of pulled into that world, and shall we say, wackiness ensues. I'll start with what I liked first of all. The subject matter is inherently interesting. I mean, the American News Corporation sort of industry is one that we know is basically batshit crazy in how they prioritise what stories they show, how they chase stories, and basically just how that sort of system works. That is an inherently interesting subject matter. Taking a character like Lou Bloom, who could quite easily sit alongside in the category of your Travis Bickle types, or Ryan Gosling's character in Drive, and just you sort of quietly driven loners. He quite happily sits in that category. So to take that character and place him in this subject matter really sort of opens up a well of potential there. Now, what I have to say as well is that I don't feel like the film really reached that potential. So anyway, starting with what I liked, Jake Gyllenhaal as Lou Bloom gives a really, really good performance, despite the fact that the script doesn't really get you inside Lou's head, and that could quite easily be intentional. Jake Gyllenhaal does a lot with it, he manages to bring a sort of wide-eyed, frantic sort of presence to the movie, and does give one of, if not his best performance to date. He was really, really good in it. I like the fact that the way it's shot is very sort of standard. I think it's shot on digital, it's shot around LA at night. But having sort of been to LA, it was nice to see that they didn't sort of try to dress it up as anything it's not. And a few films have done this now, but I always enjoy it when basically a film shows LA for the sort of shithole that it is. As much as I love the city, it shows it for what it is, and I appreciate that. I also like character interactions in the first half. Lou is a bit of a wheeler dealer. He tries to basically sell stolen goods at the beginning of the movie and attempts to barter, and just the people he's trying to barter with aren't having any of it. And I like the sort of frank realism of those character interactions. It really makes it feel a lot more grounded. But as I mentioned earlier, overall, I don't feel like the film really reached its potential. Now, the reason being is that you have a character in there, the news network manager, played by Rene Russo, who basically gives Lou a rundown of the types of stories they want him to film. I'm going to stay away from specific spoilers, and all this is in the trailer, so this isn't a spoiler. But she basically says to him, what we want is basically white people being the victim of crime, portrayed preferably by a minority or a poor person. And this is something, especially given recent events in America, race and wealth definitely play into what sort of roles on the news. You see it all the time, and I thought this is really interesting, and I hope they really go into that. But they don't. You don't really get much of an insight into how the news networks work, and I think it's a shame, because to me that's where the story is. That's where the most interesting aspects of the script are, is looking at how they sort of prioritise news stories and how race and neighbourhoods sort of factor into that. But it's addressed, but it's not explored. And I feel like that's a problem that you could apply to sort of the whole film, especially Lou Bloom's character. You never get inside his head. Now, I have a feeling that that's intentional, because I know that in the scenes where Lou's actually filming the scene of an accident or the scene of a robbery, whatever the case may be, The way it's shot is that it's always very sort of extreme close-up on Lou, or you get to see through his camera lens or screen or whatever. It's very detached, you know, you see it through his camera the same way that he's seeing it as he's filming it, and it keeps the audience at a distance. And I feel like that's intentional, because essentially that's how we are meant to feel when we're watching these news broadcasts, is that we're behind the sort of safety of a TV screen and we're not directly involved. But they seem to apply that logic to Lou's character, in that you don't really get any idea of his motivations. I mean, they sort of hint that he just basically doesn't like people, but you don't get to see inside his head. And I think given that you spend 2 hours with him, and he is the anchor for this movie, you needed a peek behind the curtain. I mean, they introduce a character played by Riz Ahmed, who basically plays Lou's assistant, who goes out with him at night to help him basically track down these accidents and film. And the only real conflict that they introduce between the two of them is related to money. You know, the sort of moral ambiguity of what they're doing and the legal ambiguity of what they're doing is only really skirted around. And I feel like had they given him a more sort of interesting and fleshed out partner character, that it would have provided the conflict that would have shown more of an insight into Lou's head. And I really think you needed that. I mean, not to begin with, but by the time you get to the end of the film, you really want to know, especially given some of the actions that Lou does, you really want to know sort of more about him and why he's doing it. So it felt all the way through the film like it's keeping the audience at a distance, and I dare say that that's intentional, but that doesn't necessarily work sort of for the film as a whole. I do feel like, in terms of it not sort of exploring American media as thoroughly or as interestingly as it could have, is that basically that aspect of it plays a much bigger role in this movie than it did in another movie that came out this year, which I really enjoyed, Gone Girl. But given that it was only a minor subplot in Gone Girl, I feel like that film did it a lot better and a lot more sort of, they fleshed that aspect out a little bit more. So I feel like this film was just sort of lacking that. I feel like it presented some really interesting ideas in terms of its subject matter, interesting characters, but it just didn't really explore them. That coupled with the fact, my partner and I were sort of discussing this on the way home, of Lou's treatment of Rene Russo's character, and you know, we agreed it would have been very interesting and something that we've not necessarily seen before had Lou Bloom's character actually been female. It feels like a sort of missed opportunity from that perspective. That's not taking anything away from Jake Gyllenhaal, because he was great in this. But the sort of gender dynamics in the movie are very standard as well. And it feels like they had an opportunity to play with that, but didn't. So it's an interesting film. It's well executed in as much as it's got a couple of the tensest scenes probably in any film this year. But it just doesn't follow through on its subject matter, which is a shame, because I did enjoy it. I really wanted to love it, and I think I was expecting much more from it. So Nightcrawler, it's not the masterpiece that people are saying it is. It's a pretty well executed little thriller. The narrative's a lot more straightforward than you would expect or hope. Jake Gyllenhaal gives a great performance, but sadly it's just not reaching its potential.